began like any other night on the road. My name's Dale, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades. I've seen my share of strange things, but what happened on that stretch of Nevada highway will stay with me forever. I was hauling a load of electronics from Reno to Salt Lake City, cruising along US Highway 50. They call it the loneliest road in America for a reason. No streetlights, no towns for miles, just endless desert and the hum of my engine. It was around 2 a.m. when I passed through Austin, Nevada. The town's lights faded quickly in my rearview mirror, leaving nothing but the dark expanse of desert around me. The only sound was a faint voice on the late-night radio talking about alien sightings. I usually found those stories entertaining, but that night, the static-filled voice gave me an odd feeling I couldn't shake. About 20 miles out of town, my CB radio crackled to life. A voice cut through the static, low and raspy. "Dale, you there?" I froze. My hands gripped the wheel tighter. No one should have known my name. I picked up the receiver and responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" Nothing but static. Then silence. I brushed it off as a prank or a glitch, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I turned the radio off, focusing on the road ahead. That's when I noticed the lights in my side mirror. At first, I thought it was a car behind me. But the lights weren't steady. They flickered, moving erratically like lanterns swaying in the wind. I slowed down, expecting the vehicle to pass, but the light stayed the same distance behind me, trailing me like a shadow. I leaned forward, squinting into the mirror, but I couldn't make out a car. There was nothing there, just those floating lights. They suddenly disappeared, vanishing as if they'd never existed. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. When I looked forward again, the lights were there, directly in my path. I hit the brakes hard. The tires screeched, and my rig groaned as it came to a stop. The lights hovered about 50 feet ahead, swaying back and forth. My headlights illuminated something strange. Those weren't headlights. They were eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, set into a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. The figure was massive, towering well above the cab of my truck. Its limbs were impossibly long and twisted, like something from a nightmare. For a moment, it just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Then it started moving. Its steps were slow but deliberate, each one accompanied by a deep, resonating thud that I could feel in my chest. I didn't wait to see what it would do. My instincts screamed at me to move, so I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The rig surged forward, and for a second, I thought I might plow right through it. But just as I got close, the creature stepped aside, its massive form disappearing into the darkness. My heart was pounding, and my hands were slick on the wheel. I thought I'd escaped, but then I heard it. A metallic screeching sound that made my stomach drop. I glanced in the side mirror and saw it again. The creature was clinging to the back of my trailer, its claws raking across the metal, leaving deep gashes. I swerved, trying to shake it loose, but it held on. The rig groaned under the strain, and I could feel the trailer rocking. My mind raced, desperate for a solution. Finally, I veered sharply to the right, sending the trailer swinging. The creature lost its grip and tumbled off, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, Ely. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, I climbed out to inspect the damage. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to the back of the trailer. Deep claw marks scored the metal, and several crates had been ripped open, their contents strewn across the trailer floor. I stared at the destruction, trying to make sense of what had happened. The other truckers didn't believe me when I told them. They laughed it off, saying I must have been tired or imagining things. But I know what I saw. There's something out there on those lonely highways, something that doesn't belong. If you ever find yourself driving through the Nevada desert, stay alert. Keep your doors locked and watch your mirrors. You might not be as alone as you think. My name's Alex, and I've been driving big rigs for nearly 15 years. There's something comforting about the open road, especially at night when the world quiets down, and it's just you, the hum of the engine, and the endless stretch of asphalt. But one night, about a year ago, I found myself on a road that didn't feel right. A road that led me somewhere I wish I'd never found. It was just past midnight, and I was driving through a remote area in Montana, a desolate stretch where there wasn't much except the occasional gas station or diner. I was on my way to the next town, about 100 miles away, when I realized I was running low on fuel. Normally, I'd have planned to stop, but I'd gotten sidetracked earlier and didn't have a chance to fill up. The fuel gauge dipped lower and I started to worry. Out here, gas stations were few and far between, and I knew I'd be in serious trouble if I ran out of fuel on these back roads. Just as I was about to consider pulling over and calling for help, I saw it. A gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. Relief washed over me, and I pulled in, noticing the station's worn-out, weather-beaten look. The sign read Jack's Fuel and Food, and it looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. But fuel was fuel, and I wasn't about to be picky. I parked by one of the pumps, cut the engine, and stepped out, the cold night air prickling my skin. The place was eerily silent, not a single car in sight, and the lights inside flickered intermittently. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, like the world had held its breath. But I shook it off and went inside, hoping to find an attendant. The interior of the station was just as outdated as the exterior. The shelves were lined with dusty cans and faded packages, and the overhead lights buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and I wondered how long it had been since anyone had stopped here. Behind the counter stood an older man, his face shadowed beneath a worn baseball cap. He looked up as I entered, his expression blank, almost empty. "Evenin'," I said, trying to sound casual. "I just need to fill up." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and gestured toward the pumps. His gaze was unsettling, a little too intense, but I shrugged it off and returned to my truck. I started pumping fuel, watching as the numbers ticked by, but something felt off. The numbers on the pump flickered erratically, as if the machine was struggling, and the fuel flowed slower than it should have. As I waited, I glanced back toward the station, only to find the old man watching me from the window, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, staring, unblinking, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I turned away, telling myself I was just tired, that the long drive was getting to me. Finally, the pump clicked, signaling it was full. I replaced the nozzle, eager to pay and get back on the road. When I stepped inside, the man was still at the counter, still staring at me with that same vacant look. "That'll be $20 even," he said, his voice a low monotone. I handed him the cash, watching as he took it with hands that were cold, almost clammy, like he'd been standing in a freezer. I wanted to ask him how long he'd been out here, how he managed to run this station all alone, but something told me not to. As I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Be careful on the road tonight." I stopped, glancing back at him, but he was already looking away, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of that old station. I nodded and left, climbing back into my truck and pulling onto the highway. I'd driven maybe 5 miles when I noticed something odd. The gas gauge hadn't moved. It was still on empty, as if I hadn't fueled up at all. I frowned, tapping the gauge, but it didn't budge. I figured the gauge was just broken, and I'd check it at the next stop. But then, I looked in the mirror and froze. The gas station was there, in my rearview mirror, exactly as it had been when I left. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow, but I was miles down the road. There was no way it should still be visible. I pressed harder on the gas, heart pounding, refusing to look back. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that maybe I'd imagined it. But a few minutes later, I glanced in the mirror again, and there it was, closer this time. The neon sign flashed, Jack's Fuel and Food, like a beacon in the darkness, always just behind me, no matter how fast I drove. Panic started to creep in. I grabbed the CB, hoping maybe someone was out there who could tell me what was happening. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" I called, my voice shaking. "This is Big Red. I'm on Route 45 heading north. Got a weird Situation here. Static filled the speakers, hissing like a warning. And then, faintly, a voice broke through, crackling with interference. Turn back. Big red. Turn back before it's too late. A chill ran through me, but I kept driving, desperate to put as much distance as I could between me and that station. I glanced in the mirror, and this time, I saw something else. A figure standing in front of the station, barely visible in the dim light. It was the old man watching me, his hand raised in a slow, solemn wave. My stomach twisted as I realized that I was the only vehicle on the road. The world around me felt empty, vast and silent, as if I'd been cut off from everything I knew. The road stretched on, the darkness deepening, and I realized I hadn't seen another car or truck for miles. Finally, the station began to fade from view, swallowed by the darkness, but the chill remained, lingering in the cab like a ghost. I drove for hours, watching the fuel gauge, hoping that whatever strange spell I'd been under had finally lifted. When I reached the next town, I pulled into a different gas station, eager to fill up and shake off the lingering unease. I asked the attendant if he knew of any station called Jack's Fuel and Food on Route 45. He looked at me, frowning. There hasn't been a Jack's on Route 45 for years. Burned down in the late 70s. Heard the owner died in the fire, too. Never rebuilt. I felt a chill run down my spine as his words sank in. I paid for the fuel, climbed back into my truck, and left that town as fast as I could, heart pounding as I replayed the night's events in my mind. I don't know what happened that night, or if I'd somehow crossed paths with something that shouldn't exist. But every time I drive through those back roads, I keep an eye on the fuel gauge, and I always make sure I have enough to get me through. Because I don't ever want to see Jack's Fuel and Food in my rearview mirror again. The name's Ron, and I've been on the road long enough to know that the highway has its share of secrets. There's an unwritten code between truckers. You see something strange, you keep it to yourself. We've all had those weird moments, the ones you try to forget by morning. But last winter, on a lonely stretch in northern Idaho, I came across something I can't shake. It was a little after midnight, the sky thick with snow, and I was making a last-minute delivery before the holidays. The road was empty, visibility low, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. I was heading to a warehouse just off Route 73, one of those old abandoned roads that didn't even show up on most maps. I almost missed the turn, the sign half buried in snow and rusted to the point of illegibility. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield as I made the turn, the truck lurching over the uneven road. My headlights barely cut through the heavy snow, illuminating the road just enough to show me where to go. After about 15 minutes of creeping along, I saw the warehouse up ahead, a massive, hulking building that looked like it had been left to rot. The windows were boarded up and a faint light flickered from within, casting shadows across the crumbling walls. I parked the truck, shut off the engine, and climbed out, feeling the bitter cold bite through my jacket. My instructions were clear. Drop the load in the dock at the back of the warehouse. No contact, no paperwork, just unload and go. I'd done these kinds of gigs before, usually for shady clients who didn't want questions asked. But as I walked through the snow toward the dock, something felt off. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed it. The silence. Absolute, unnatural silence. Not a single sound, not even the wind, as if the snow had swallowed every noise. I felt my pulse quicken, but I shook it off, figuring it was just the late hour getting to me. When I reached the dock, I noticed a faint smell in the air, something sharp and metallic, like rusted metal mixed with something rotten. I hesitated, glancing at the loading doors, which were slightly ajar, creaking as they swung in the windless air. The flickering light inside was dim, barely illuminating the interior, but I could make out the outline of crates and old machinery. I backed the truck up, positioning it at the edge of the dock, and went to open the cargo doors. As I did, a low, guttural sound echoed from inside the warehouse, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was a voice, faint but distinct, whispering words I couldn't understand, words that seemed to twist and warp in the air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. Silence. But as I stood there staring into the darkness, I saw something move, a shadow, tall and thin, just at the edge of the flickering light. I took a step back, heart pounding, but before I could react, the shadow moved again, closer this time, and I caught a glimpse of something. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. It wore the tattered remains of what looked like an old uniform, something from another era, and its mouth twisted into a grin that made my blood run cold. "Are you here for the delivery?" I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. It didn't answer, just stared at me with those empty eyes, its grin widening. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away, caught in its gaze. The air grew colder, an icy chill settling over me, and I could feel something pressing down on my chest, like a weight I couldn't shake. Finally, I forced myself to look away, breaking whatever spell it had cast over me. I stumbled backward, fumbling with the cargo doors, desperate to unload and get out of there. But as I started moving the crates onto the dock, I realized I was no longer alone. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, one by one, each dressed in the same tattered uniform, their faces gaunt, eyes empty, staring at me with that same unnerving grin. They moved slowly, silently, surrounding the truck, watching as I unloaded the cargo, never saying a word. My heart raced as I threw the last crate onto the dock, slamming the doors shut and bolting back to the cab. I didn't look back, didn't dare meet their eyes again. I just climbed into the truck, turned the key, and hit the gas, pulling away from the warehouse as fast as I could. But as I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figures were standing in the middle of the road watching me, their faces illuminated by the truck's taillights, their grins wider, almost mocking. And then, as I watched, they began to fade, one by one, dissolving into the snow, leaving nothing but empty darkness. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. I pulled over shaking and climbed out, hoping to catch my breath. The gas station attendant gave me a strange look, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't even find the words to explain. The next morning I tried calling the client, tried asking about the delivery, but the number was disconnected. I checked the address, drove back to where the warehouse should have been, but there was nothing there. Just an empty lot covered in snow, with no sign of a building, no sign of anything. To this day, I don't know what happened that night or who, or what, I delivered to. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can still feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting for the next delivery. And I know deep down that one day I'll be back on that road, whether I want to be or not. I'm Dave, a long-haul trucker with a couple of decades on the road, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. But one night last year, while driving through southern Colorado, I had an experience I can't explain. It was the middle of the night, pitch black, and I'd been driving for hours with no sign of a rest area or gas station. I was dead tired, hoping to find somewhere to pull over and close my eyes for a few minutes. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A rest stop just ahead, the blue and white sign barely visible in the darkness. Relieved, I pulled in, parking beneath a flickering street lamp. The building was small, but the lights were on, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. I didn't see any other cars or trucks, but at that hour I wasn't surprised. As I stepped out, I noticed a strange silence, a stillness that seemed to settle over everything. Even the crickets were quiet, the only sound my footsteps crunching on the gravel. I headed toward the building, eager to use the restroom and grab a coffee from the vending machine. Inside, the place was surprisingly clean, almost too clean, like it hadn't been touched in years. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and cold. I walked to the restroom, pushing open the door, and froze. In the dim light, I saw someone standing by the sink, staring at their reflection in the mirror. He was an older man, with a pale, weathered face and eyes that seemed empty, like they'd seen too much. I cleared my throat, feeling a little awkward. "Sorry, didn't mean to sneak up on you," I said, trying to keep things light. The man didn't respond, didn't even blink. He just kept staring at himself, his eyes unblinking, mouth twisted into a slight frown. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off, figuring he was just tired like me. I went to one of the stalls, relieved to finally take a break. But as I sat there, I started to hear something. Soft whispers, faint and indistinct, like a conversation happening just outside the door. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but they were too low, too garbled. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a strange sense of dread, like I shouldn't be here, like I was intruding. Finally, I finished up, washed my hands, and headed back to the main area. The man was still there, still staring at himself in the mirror, his expression unchanged. I nodded to him as I passed, but he didn't acknowledge me, didn't even seem to see me. I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine, but as I took a sip, I nearly gagged. The coffee was ice cold, like it had been sitting there for hours. I dumped it, deciding it was time to get back on the road. As I headed out, I noticed a bulletin board by the door, covered with missing persons flyers. There were dozens of them, all with the same blank, haunted expression as the man in the restroom. I shivered, pulling my jacket closer as I stepped outside. But as I looked around, my heart skipped a beat. My truck was the only vehicle in the lot, and the street lamp was off. The entire rest stop was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon. Feeling uneasy, I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt a chill run down my spine. The rest stop was gone. I could see the empty stretch of highway behind me, but no sign of the building, no lights, nothing but darkness. Confused, I checked my GPS, but it didn't show any rest stops for miles. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, that I must have imagined the whole thing. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About 20 miles later, I finally reached a real rest stop, one I recognized. I pulled in, my hands shaking, and sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had happened. But as I glanced out the window, I saw him. The man from the restroom standing by the entrance, staring at me with those same empty eyes. I blinked, and he was gone, just a shadow disappearing into the darkness. I haven't stopped at an unfamiliar rest stop since. I'm Randy, a long-haul driver with a decade on the road, and I've learned that nights can get weird out here. But nothing comes close to the night I spent driving through eastern Nevada, a stretch of empty highway surrounded by desert and mountains. It was around 2 a.m., and the only company I had was the faint hum of the CB radio and the occasional trucker checking in on Channel 19. The night was quiet, the road stretching on endlessly, with nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was halfway through my route, sipping stale coffee to keep myself awake when the CB crackled to life. At first, it was just static, faint and erratic, but then a voice broke through, barely audible, like someone whispering in the middle of the static. "Randy!" I nearly spilled my coffee, glancing down at the radio. I hadn't heard anyone use my name over the CB that night, and I hadn't checked in since I hit the road. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a trick of the mind, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Randy, do you hear me?" My hands tightened on the wheel as I picked up the mic. "This is Big Randy. Who's calling?" Silence. Just a low hiss of static broken by faint pops and crackles. I frowned, adjusting the dial, but the silence continued. With a sigh, I put the mic back and tried to forget about it. But a few minutes later, the voice returned. "Randy, don't stop, keep driving." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. I'd heard stories about weird transmissions on these empty stretches, ghost signals that come through in the dead of night. But this was different. This voice knew my name, knew I was out here alone. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The radio crackled, but the voice didn't respond. Instead, the static grew louder, filling the cab with a strange, buzzing noise that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I reached to turn off the radio, but before I could, the voice returned, faint and distorted. "Don't stop. No matter what you see." I glanced around, my nerves on edge. The road was empty, just an endless ribbon of asphalt stretching through the darkness. But something about the voice, the warning, sent a chill down my spine. I kept driving, every shadow along the side of the road making my pulse race. About 10 minutes later, I saw something ahead, a faint figure on the side of the highway, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his arm raised as if he were hitchhiking. A part of me wanted to stop to see if he needed help, but the voice echoed in my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. I gripped the wheel, pressing down on the gas, refusing to look at the figure as I sped past. But as I glanced in the mirror, my heart stopped. The figure was standing in the middle of the road now, staring after me, his face pale and empty, eyes reflecting the taillights like mirrors. I shivered, focusing on the road ahead, refusing to look back. But every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of him in the mirror, always there, always watching, no matter how fast I drove. The radio crackled again, the voice cutting through the static. "Don't look back. He's getting closer." My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to keep my eyes forward, to ignore the faint figure in the mirror. The voice was right. I could feel him, sense him closing in, his gaze burning into my back. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure appeared again, this time directly in front of the truck. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just inches away from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared at me with those empty eyes, a slow, chilling smile spreading across his face. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow, I understood. "Turn back, Randy." My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I threw the truck into reverse, backing away, but he followed, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. Desperate, I grabbed the CB mic, hoping someone, anyone, was out there. "This is Big Randy. Anyone out there? I need help," I called, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, through the static, the voice returned. "Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't let him in." I slammed the truck into gear, speeding down the highway, my eyes glued to the road, refusing to look back. The radio buzzed with static, the voice growing fainter, more distant, until it finally faded completely, leaving me alone in the silence. I drove for hours, never daring to stop, not until the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. Only then did I pull over, my hands shaking as I climbed out of the cab, breathing in the cold morning air, grateful to be out of that nightmare stretch. I haven't used Channel 19 since, and every time I drive through eastern Nevada, I feel that chill, that sense of being watched, and I remember the voice, the warning that kept me alive. Don't stop, no matter what you see. The name's Travis, and I've been trucking long enough to know when something isn't right on the road. One night last fall, I had a close call with something I still can't explain. I was driving through northern Maine, where the roads are narrow and the woods are thick. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., and the fog had rolled in thick as soup, limiting my visibility to barely a few feet ahead. I was navigating cautiously, headlights barely piercing the heavy fog. The CB radio was silent, which was unusual. I always like to hear other drivers check in now and then, even if just for a bit of background noise. But that night, it was just me, the truck, and the eerie quiet of the fog-covered road. After a few miles, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It was an odd sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I rounded a curve, I saw something up ahead, a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a slow stop. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, half shrouded in the fog. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a stranded motorist. But as I looked closer, I realized something was off. The figure was too tall, too thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and it was wrapped in what looked like tattered old-fashioned clothes. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't look away. Couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring right back at me. I picked up the CB, hoping maybe someone else was nearby, someone who could confirm what I was seeing. Breaker, breaker. This is Big T. Anyone out there? I got something strange on Route 97. Anyone nearby? Silence. I glanced back at the figure, and my heart skipped a beat. It had moved, stepping closer to the truck, still half hidden in the fog. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I dropped the CB, shifted the truck into reverse, and backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. But as I did, the fog thickened, swallowing it from view. I kept reversing, hoping to get far enough away that it would disappear completely. But then, I heard something, a low shuffling sound, like footsteps on gravel, coming from somewhere behind the truck. I froze, staring into the mirrors, but all I could see was fog, thick and impenetrable. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right next to the truck. I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding, and forced myself to look out the driver's side window. There it was, standing right outside the cab, staring in at me with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with sunken cheeks and lips twisted into a slight, unsettling smile. It lifted a bony hand, placing it on the window, leaving a smear of something dark and wet. I could barely breathe, frozen in place as it leaned closer, its mouth opening as if to speak. But no sound came out, just a faint hissing, like a whisper carried on the wind. Desperate, I floored the gas, jerking the truck forward, tearing down the road with no regard for the fog or the twisted curves. The figure vanished from view, swallowed by the mist, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following, that it was somehow keeping pace with the truck. The radio crackled to life, static filling the cab, followed by a faint, distorted voice. Travis. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone my name, hadn't spoken to another soul all night. The voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but I could feel it, like a breath against my ear. Travis, stop the truck. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. I gripped the wheel, ignoring the voice, pressing down harder on the gas, watching the speedometer climb as I tore through the fog. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the cab with its hissing, static-laced words. Travis, stop. You're almost there. Almost there. The words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't afford to slow down. I kept my eyes on the road, heart pounding, barely breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift, revealing the dark, empty highway stretching out ahead. Relieved, I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly swerved off the road. The figure was there, sitting in the middle of the road, watching me with those hollow eyes, its head tilted as if amused. And then, slowly, it raised a hand, pointing down the road, as if guiding me somewhere, or waiting for me to follow. I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I drove for miles, not daring to slow down until I reached a gas station at the edge of town. I pulled in, parked the truck, and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to shake the image of that figure from my mind. The clerk inside looked up as I stumbled in, pale and shaking. He asked if I was okay, and I mumbled something about a weird night on Route 97. His expression changed, and he nodded slowly. Yeah, a few folks have seen him, he said quietly. They call him the Fog Walker. He shows up on nights like this, out there in the mist, waiting for, well, we're not sure what he's waiting for. I haven't taken that route since, but every so often when I'm driving through thick fog, I think about the Fog Walker. and I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next driver to stop and listen. The name's Pete, and I've been driving big rigs for over 20 years. You get used to strange sights on the road, especially at night, when everything seems just a bit off. But there was one night in Arizona that still keeps me up. A night when I saw something that didn't belong. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was on Route 191, a long, lonely stretch cutting through the desert. The night was clear, the stars bright, and the only sound was the low hum of my engine as I cruised along. I hadn't seen another car for miles, just the empty desert and the long, dark road ahead. Then, up ahead, I saw something unusual. A line of small lights stretching across the highway. At first I thought it was a row of taillights, maybe a convoy of trucks. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving. The lights just hovered there, flickering faintly, forming a straight line across the road. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The lights were low to the ground, like lanterns or flashlights, but there was no sign of anyone holding them. They just floated there, casting an eerie glow over the asphalt, illuminating a stretch of road that seemed wrong. Something told me to turn around, to avoid whatever was happening up ahead. But curiosity got the better of me, and I rolled forward, stopping a few yards away from the line of lights. I turned off the engine, stepping out of the cab to get a closer look. The desert air cold and still. The lights were strange, each one a dull bluish hue that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I walked up to them, reaching out to touch one, but my hand passed right through it. There was no heat, no substance, just a faint glow that shimmered like a mirage. As I stood there, I heard a faint hum, low and steady, like the sound of distant machinery. I looked around, half expecting to see a car or another truck, but the road was empty, just me, the lights, and the desert stretching endlessly into the darkness. And then, out of nowhere, I felt a presence, a heavy, suffocating feeling, like something was watching me. I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the desert and the empty road. The hum grew louder, filling the air, vibrating through my chest, and I felt a sudden urge to run, to get back in my truck and leave. But as I took a step back, I noticed something else, shadows moving along the edge of the road, flickering in the dim light. The shadows were tall and thin, like people but stretched and distorted, their movements slow and deliberate. They glided along the road, their forms flickering like the lights, as if they weren't fully there. I backed up slowly, my pulse racing, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadows moved closer, gathering around the line of lights, their faces hidden in darkness. I could feel their eyes on me, feel the weight of their gaze pressing down, like they were waiting for something. I took another step back, and as I did, one of the shadows looked up, its face catching the faint glow of the lights. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull the light in, swallowing it like a black hole. It raised a hand, reaching out toward me, and I stumbled back, heart pounding. Without thinking, I turned and ran, climbing back into the cab and slamming the door shut. I started the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, refusing to look back. But as I pulled away, the lights began to move, drifting across the road as if guiding me. I floored the gas, speeding down the road, watching the line of lights disappear in the rearview mirror. But as I drove, I noticed something strange. The road kept stretching on, longer and longer, as if it would never end. The lights had vanished, but their glow lingered, faint and eerie, like an afterimage burned into my vision. For what felt like hours, I drove, watching the road stretch endlessly ahead, feeling the presence of those shadows, like they were still following, watching, waiting. The hum was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. A silence that felt wrong, like the desert itself had stopped breathing. Finally, as dawn broke over the horizon, I saw a sign. A battered, rusted marker for a town I knew was only 10 miles away. I pulled off at the first gas station I saw, parking the truck and sitting there, trying to catch my breath, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I asked the clerk if he'd ever seen anything strange on Route 191, but he just shrugged, giving me a curious look. "Some folks say that road's haunted," he said, his voice low. "They call it the Road of Lights. They say if you see the lights, it means you've crossed into the other side, where things don't work the same. I haven't driven that route since, but every time I pass through Arizona, I can still feel it. The hum, the lights, the shadows that waited by the road. And I know deep down that if I ever take that road again, they'll be waiting for me." I'm called Slim, been trucking across the country for over 30 years, and I've had my share of strange encounters. There's something about the open road, especially at night, that invites a kind of darkness most people can't imagine. But nothing compares to the night I picked up a passenger who shouldn't have been there. It was just after midnight, somewhere in Wyoming, on a lonesome stretch of highway where the mountains cast long, dark shadows over the road. The night was clear, the stars bright, but a biting cold hung in the air. I was wide awake, yet something felt off, a strange heaviness pressing down on the cab, like the air itself was charged with something unseen. I was a few hours out from my next stop when I saw her. A figure standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched, bathed in the glow of my headlights. She was young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in a thin, pale dress that seemed wildly out of place for a night this cold. Her head was down, hair falling over her face, hiding her eyes. I'm not in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But something about her seemed different, almost desperate. Against my better judgment, I pulled over, rolling down the window just enough to call out, "You okay, miss?" She looked up then, her face pale, lips parted as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a strange jolt, like I'd seen her somewhere before, though I couldn't place it. She nodded, stepping closer. "Could you give me a ride?" "Just a few miles down the road." Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should say no, that picking her up was a bad idea. But before I could think it through, I unlocked the door, and she climbed in. As I started driving, an uncomfortable silence settled in the cab. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed, if she was all right, but she didn't answer, didn't even look at me. She just sat there, like she was in a trance, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the road. After a few minutes, I noticed something odd. The temperature in the cab had dropped, like someone had opened a window. I glanced over at her, but she hadn't moved. Her pale hands still clasped tightly in her lap, her face blank. I was about to ask if she was cold when she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you seen them?" "Seen who?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "The shadows," she said, her voice hollow. "They follow, even when you think you've left them behind." I didn't know how to respond, so I focused on the road, trying to ignore the strange heaviness that seemed to fill the cab. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadowy figure standing by the side of the road, just outside the reach of the headlights. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but as we drove on, I saw more of them. Dark figures, barely visible, standing by the side of the road, watching as we passed. They didn't move, didn't react, just stared with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to follow us. I tried to keep my focus, telling myself it was just exhaustion, just the long hours messing with my mind. But as the figures grew more frequent, I felt the tension in the cab deepen, like the very air was closing in on me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you know them?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She nodded slowly, her face expressionless. "They're always here, waiting." I gripped the wheel tighter, heart pounding, and kept driving, hoping the figures would disappear, that this nightmare would end. But the further we went, the closer the figures seemed to come. their forms becoming clearer, more defined. And then as we rounded a bend, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing in the middle of the road, blocking the path ahead. I hit the brakes, heart racing, and brought the truck to a stop just inches away from them. I turned to the girl, but she was gone. The seat beside me was empty, the door closed, as if she'd never been there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. But then I felt it. A presence. Something cold and heavy pressing down on my shoulders, filling the cab with a suffocating weight. I looked out the window, heart pounding, and saw her standing among the figures, her face blank, eyes empty, staring at me with that same hollow gaze. And then, in unison, they all raised their hands, pointing down the road, as if guiding me somewhere. I floored the gas, desperate to escape, but the figures didn't move. They stood there, watching as I drove through them, their forms flickering like shadows cast by a dying light. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into a gas station and stumbling out of the cab, breathing hard. The attendant gave me a strange look, but I didn't bother explaining. How could I? To this day, I don't know if she was real, if any of it was real. But every time I drive that stretch of road, I see them. Shadows lurking just beyond the headlights, watching, waiting. And I know that if I ever stop, if I ever pick up another passenger on that road, I may not be able to leave them behind. I'm Lou, a trucker who's driven more miles than I can count, and I've heard my share of creepy tales from fellow drivers. But there's one story I never believed until it happened to me, the story of the ghost on mile marker 42. It was a cold winter night, somewhere in the Midwest, and I was hauling a load down a lonely stretch of highway. The road was deserted, the snow falling in thick, silent sheets that seemed to muffle everything. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of my CB. As I passed mile marker 41, a strange feeling settled over me, a sense of unease, like something wasn't right. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the cold getting to me. But as I approached mile marker 42, I saw something in the distance. A figure stood by the side of the road, barely visible in the beam of my headlights. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned coat, her hair tangled and wild, her face hidden beneath the hood. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching as I got closer. I slowed down, unsure of what I was seeing. It wasn't unusual to see stranded motorists, but something about her felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but a chill ran down my spine as I pulled up alongside her, rolling down the window just enough to call out, "You need help, miss?" She didn't answer, didn't even look at me. Her face was shadowed, hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel her gaze, cold and empty, piercing through me. I felt a strange urge to keep going, to leave her there, but something held me back. Finally, she looked up, and I saw her face, pale, almost gray, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, she said, "Please, take me home." Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Numbly, I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, settling into the seat with a quiet, eerie calm. As I started driving again, an unnatural silence filled the cab. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead, her gaze unfocused, distant. I tried to ask her where she was headed, but she didn't respond, didn't even blink. It was like she wasn't really there, like she was somewhere else entirely. We drove in silence for a while, and I began to notice the cold. The temperature in the cab had dropped drastically, the windows fogging up despite the heater blasting full force. I shivered, glancing at her, but she didn't seem to notice. She just sat there staring ahead, as if she was lost in some other world. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Where do you need to go?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She turned to me then, her hollow eyes meeting mine, and I felt a chill run through me, deeper than anything I'd ever felt. Her lips moved, forming words that seemed to echo in my mind rather than in the air. Mile marker 42. Where it all ended. My blood ran cold. I'd heard the stories about mile marker 42, the tales of the ghostly woman who wandered that stretch of highway, searching for someone to take her home. But I'd always brushed them off as myths, stories made up to scare rookies on the road. I tried to keep my composure, telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But the air in the cab grew heavier, colder, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I felt a strange sense of dread, like I was driving into something dark and endless. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. I blinked, glancing at the passenger seat, but it was empty. The door was still closed, the seat belt untouched, as if she'd never been there at all. I glanced in the mirror, heart pounding, and saw her standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. Her face was blank, her eyes empty, but I could feel her gaze, feel the weight of her sorrow pressing down on me. Desperate to put distance between us, I floored the gas, speeding down the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. But as I glanced at the dashboard, I noticed something strange. The odometer was stuck on 42, frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped. Finally, I saw the glow of a rest stop up ahead. I pulled in, parking the truck and sitting there, trying to catch my breath, trying to shake off the lingering dread. I'd heard about mile marker 42 for years, heard the stories of truckers who'd picked up the ghostly woman, only to find themselves lost in an endless loop of fog and darkness. I haven't taken that route since, but every so often when I'm on an empty road at night, I catch a glimpse of her in the distance, standing by the side of the highway, her eyes hollow and pleading. And I know deep down that she's still waiting, searching for someone to take her home. My name's Jake, and after more than 15 years as a long-haul driver, I thought I'd seen it all. Strange lights, weird encounters at gas stations, even a couple of phantom hitchhikers. But nothing prepared me for the night I drove through northern Texas and joined a convoy that shouldn't have been there. It was a quiet night, just me and the open road, heading south on a route I knew well. The road was empty, and the stars stretched across the sky like a map, guiding me through the dark desert. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and there was a peaceful, almost eerie calm in the air. Around midnight, I spotted a row of lights up ahead, a line of taillights moving steadily down the highway. I figured it was a convoy of trucks, maybe 3 or 4 rigs driving in formation. I'd driven in convoys before. It was a good way to keep your mind sharp, a bit of company in the lonely hours. I sped up to catch them, hoping to fall in line. As I got closer, I counted 5 trucks in total, their shapes just visible in the dim glow of their taillights. The strange thing was, there was no company name on any of them, no logos or numbers, just plain, dark rigs, identical in every way. Something felt off, but I shook it off, chalking it up to the quiet night. I radioed over the CB, hoping to introduce myself, but all I got back was static. I tried again, calling out to the lead truck, but there was no response, just that faint, unsettling hiss. I shrugged and fell into formation at the back of the convoy, matching their speed as we moved down the road. We drove like that for miles, the hum of my engine blending with theirs, the road stretching endlessly ahead. But as I followed, I started to notice something strange. The trucks moved in perfect unison, their wheels turning in sync, their lights flickering in the same rhythm, almost like they were one. Even the way they shifted lanes was identical, no delay, no hesitation. It was unnatural, like they were connected by some invisible thread, some force guiding them that wasn't human. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I kept driving, too curious to break away. I tried the CB again, hoping someone would respond, but the static only grew louder, filling the cab with a low, almost menacing hum. Then, out of nowhere, the lead truck's lights flickered and vanished, leaving the rest of us in darkness. I hit the brakes, heart pounding, but the trucks in front of me kept going, their taillights reappearing like ghostly red orbs in the distance. One by one, the trucks vanished, disappearing into the night as if they'd been swallowed by the darkness. I slowed down, staring into the empty road ahead, my mind racing. I was alone again. The road silent, the convoy gone. Confused, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard and froze. It was still midnight, exactly the same time it had been when I first spotted the convoy, even though I'd been driving for what felt like hours. I checked the odometer, but the mileage hadn't changed either, as if I hadn't moved at all. My skin prickled, a deep, gnawing sense of dread settling over me. I grabbed the CB, my hands shaking, and tried calling out again. "Breaker, breaker, this is Jake. Anyone else out here?" The static buzzed, louder than before, filling the cab with a harsh grating sound. And then, just for a second, I heard a voice, low, distorted, like it was coming from 100 miles away. "Turn back. Jake." My heart skipped a beat and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt familiar, like I'd heard it before in a dream or a memory I couldn't place. I looked in the mirror, half expecting to see the convoy behind me. But the road was empty, just an endless stretch of asphalt leading back into the dark. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I needed to find a rest stop and get some sleep. But as I started to pull off onto the next exit, the CB crackled again, that same voice cutting through the static. "Don't stop. Keep driving." The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a strange pull, a force compelling me to follow the voice's instructions. I stayed on the highway, the exit fading into the distance behind me, and drove for what felt like hours, though the clock still read midnight. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw the convoy again. The line of trucks appeared out of the darkness, moving steadily down the road, their lights flickering like beacons in the night. This time I didn't try to catch up. I stayed back, watching as they moved in perfect unison, their forms barely visible in the dim glow of their lights. And then, just like before, they vanished, swallowed by the darkness, leaving me alone on the empty road. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. I'd heard stories of ghost convoys, of phantom trucks that appeared on lonely highways, leading drivers to their doom. But I'd never believed them, until now. The next morning I reached my destination, grateful to see the sunlight, to feel the weight of reality settle over me. But every time I'm on a dark highway, I keep an eye out for them, that convoy of silent trucks that moves like one, disappearing into the night. And I know deep down that if I ever try to join them again, I might not come back.